It's so nice to see everyone. My name is Stephen Mitchell, and I live in Athens, Georgia, and serve at First United Methodist Church in Athens, Georgia. And I serve as president-elect of the fellowship. So on behalf of the fellowship, welcome to this webinar, God, Our Help, Our Hope, Worship Revisioned. We're glad you're here. First, let me remind you that this webinar was offered free to you, but it was suggested that you make a donation to the annual fund. I made my donation on Monday, and I didn't donate because the fellowship needs money, although it does. I gave because of all of you, because I feel that what we do as worship leaders collectively is so much more important than what we can do individually. We're better artists in our community when we're sharing our ideas and loving each other well than we could ever be when we work alone. So I gave in thanks for Mary and Daniel and Tom and Nancy and each one of you I see on screen who all inspire me to be a better leader in my congregation. So I hope you will consider giving to the annual fund. Now, I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to introduce Mary Scifres, who is one of my really, really good friends. Mary has served as a church consultant and leadership coach for more than 2 decades, along with her role as a United Methodist pastor and an author for Abington Press. Mary guides churches and leaders and businesses to reclaim their purpose and refocus their mission, unifying and energizing their work in the process. I love that sentence. Mary has a Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Sacred Music from Boston University. And that was made possible by the fellowship in part because she was on the Tom Jones Scholarship throughout her education. Mary's been a very active member of the fellowship, beginning in the New England chapter. Let's hear it for New England people. Michigan chapter. I already know we have lots of Michigan people here. Convocation design teams, and eventually serving on the National Council. You probably know her best with her partnership with David Bone, our former executive director, as a frequent event and workshop leader, but the co-author with David of the United Methodist Worship Music and Worship Planner and its companion Prepare. She and her husband BJ, who is absolutely as wonderful as she is, also write for the Abington Worship Annual. I think she will share in a little bit about her newest resource, but it's called Creative Worship Made Easy. It includes song lists, videos, image recommendations, sermon starters, and words for worship, all coordinated around themes and series. You can visit her website for a full list of information. I particularly love her book about communion there. I use it a lot in my communion planning. On a personal note, Mary and I have served on so many committees together.
Yes, we have.
And once we even served on a committee of Christian educators when they roped us into helping them.
That's
And Mary kept me sane throughout all those meetings and through all the meetings I've been in with her. But most importantly, in 2016, December of 2016, Mary was the officiant for mine and my husband's wedding out in California after having met at a fellowship event. So to her core, Mary is generous and loving, and she is passionate about worship and leadership and the fellowship. So Mary, thank you for your time, and we look forward to what you have to share with us.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, everybody. It's an honor to be here, and just really grateful that we can be in this together and learning together and leading together. Just to give you a little bit of an overview in case you haven't been in a webinar with me, this will be an interactive webinar. So you are allowed to unmute yourselves and speak whenever we get to different points in the webinar. My assistant, Carrie Kellogg, you'll see on your screen there, will also be monitoring the chat, where you can find an address if you want to send in your donation to the fellowship. That can be done there. But Carrie also will monitor if you have questions or input and you prefer to do it in chat versus speaking, you are welcome to put it there. Or if something comes up while I'm talking and you don't want to interrupt, just put it in the chat. But we will have, I'll present for 4 or 5 minutes and then we'll talk about it, and I'll learn your ideas and we'll learn from each other. And then I'll present for 4 or 5 minutes and then we'll talk about it, and you'll share some ideas and I'll share some ideas. So we'll have a lot of interactive time together, and do stay to the end. There are several free offers that you're not going to want to miss. And the replay will be available. So if you have to leave early, or if you know of a friend who signed up who isn't here, there is not a worry. Everybody who registered will get a link to the replay in about a week. And you'll also get a link to the slide deck from all of the teaching slides tomorrow. So thank you for registering. Thank you on behalf of Mary Scifres Ministries and the fellowship for letting us into your Wednesday morning or Wednesday noonday so that we can learn together. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and have Daniel move us to our next slide and talk with you about what was inspiring me as I've been thinking about how God has been our help and our hope in these last 2 years. The reality is God has been our help and our hope since the first dawning of creation. And that remembrance has helped me get through this pandemic. The pandemic has certainly been chaos. And if you're a worship leader, it's been chaos on a weekly basis. Remember those first few weeks in March of 2020? And we all scrambled, and we scrambled in a million different ways, and things worked and things didn't work. And we thought we'd be back by Easter or Pentecost or 4th of July. And then just more chaos came, because then we started trying to order equipment and it wasn't available. It's been a chaotic season. And then churches began reopening and we had to learn how to do both in person and online. It's been one chaotic turn after another. But I am reminded that chaos was the beginning of God's creation. In the beginning, darkness covered the earth. The waters were threatening. They were just tumultuous everywhere. And God separated those waters and began to create order. This first story in Genesis chapter 1 reminds me that creativity emerges from chaos, that chaos doesn't need to define us. And as worship leaders, artists, musicians, most all of us are creatives in some sense or another. And so we are especially gifted to address times of chaos because most of us are gifted with creativity. And I have been so appreciative and admiring of the many of you for whom you have let your creativity bring order into the chaos, bring imagination, new possibilities, create different kinds of chaos to try new things that maybe you wouldn't have had the courage to try before. And I can share some stories with you of the creativity that I've seen, but I think I'm going to ask Daniel to go to our questions and ask you to tell me your stories. Both your stories of chaos and particularly the chaos now. I don't think we need to repeat the last 2 years because it's been, wow, we could spend the whole hour on that. But what chaos is challenging you right now? And what creativity is calling you forward? So I'll let us put back onto the gallery view and see all of our faces. Feel free to unmute and just chime in. I'll try to call on people as I see you unmuting. Or again, if you're more comfortable typing something into the chat, feel free to type it into the chat. What chaos is challenging you right now? And what creativity is calling you forward? Anybody?
Mary, I'll start. It's Mel. We have a challenge because our multimedia team coordinator resigned, and we want to, at this time, as we look forward to in-person, we would like to strengthen that team. And so that's a real challenge, but praise God, we have great volunteers. It's just the glitches. The other part, and I'm sure a lot of you are feeling this, Hawaii is out in the ocean somewhere, but even on our own congregation and our neighborhood, we would like to reconnect. That's the part we are trying to be more creative, the reconnection.
Wonderful.
So may I add that we started drive-through communion. We started it a month ago. We've had 2 already. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Drive-through communion. What a wonderful way to connect with your community and to be creative in how we can actually celebrate communion together in this pandemic. Others, what chaos is challenging you? What creativity is calling you forward?
Lisa here from Arkansas. Like I say, I'm new to this church, 3 months now, but as being said, getting people back into worship, but the connecting of the people, I think, helps make a beginning to it. So what I did for Veterans Day, which will be actually tomorrow, this will show up tomorrow, due to the past year and a half of video making and did virtual choirs and that kind of thing. I had the congregation send me pictures of themselves if they were a veteran, or their parents, their siblings, their children, anyone who has served in the military. And I recorded Let There Be Peace on Earth on the piano. And so their pictures will show tomorrow during worship, not during worship, but on Facebook and on the church website. But the thing was, they didn't know how to take a picture off the wall and crop it and send to me. And so they were learning some of these techniques to help on that. But they are going to see how they are connected to so many people because of the veterans. And so each idea I may come up with, I've mentioned about at Christmas for to have the church people, and this more helps get some of the females in there, take a picture of their nativity from their home and make a video that's going to say from the home of, and have I don't know what song yet to play underneath it, but just every month or two throw out some kind of a video there, and that's connecting them, and it's bringing them back together, and it's bringing them hopefully back into the church too. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Beautiful way of connecting. And I like that it had multiple layers of connection, giving people some technical abilities that they can use in other aspects of their life, which is a gift we have given to people and can continue to give to people. I think of how many of you taught your people how to use Zoom or how to get on Facebook Live or on YouTube to watch a video. But also that beautiful way of reminding them we are community and we have wider circles of connection. And I've seen so many All Saints videos this year that included not just church members that passed away, but friends of church members, families of church members, extended family, to remind us that the family of God is so much more than just one little circle of connections. So thank you, Lisa. That's beautiful. I saw in the chat a couple challenges. Carrie, you want to read one or two of those for us?
To summarize, one of them was specific to having accepted a new appointment during this time, and how do you connect to your new congregation when so many are online or we're not seeing them in person. Specific to another one that had brought up just connecting in general when so many are not coming back, and how to get them back into in-person worship. And how do you connect with those that are worshiping online to those who are worshiping in person, and specific to how do you connect online if you don't have in-person singing? How do you share that music in both situations?
So remind me to come back to the music one, Carrie, if I forget, because I want to pull on this connection thing first. I am hearing that yearning for connection as a theme of this ending of the second year of the pandemic, right? As we move into probably the third year of the pandemic, I think that yearning for connection is the common theme I'm hearing across the globe, across denominations, across sizes of church. And I want to give a couple hints of things I've seen that work. And one of the things that I've seen that works is for us to look at our online church worshiping community as a second worship service. For those of you who worshiped and led worship through the 80s and 90s, you remember the days when we began adding a second contemporary or alternative worship style service. But we had to learn how to make sure the community stayed connected. Otherwise, we ended up with two churches that often were in conflict with each other. Remember those days? I think this is the same kind of ambiance we're now in. And I'm a big believer in affirming that the online worshiping community is a valid worshiping community. At the church that I'm serving, we will be doing online only for our late Christmas Eve and for the Sunday after Christmas. And both to allow our staffs to be with their families on those holidays. We'll do an early in-person worship service when it's light and easy to drive and young families can attend. But the late service, which is usually the big service, is going to be all online. And the Sunday after Christmas will be all online. And part of that is to validate that half of our membership are still worshiping online only. So we have about 80 to 100 returning to in-person, and we have about 80 to 100 worshiping online each week. It's an evenly divided congregation. That connection, as we think about connection, I want to encourage you to validate and affirm your online community as much as you do your in-person community. And I heard the yearning in that question in the chat about, oh, what do I do when people aren't coming back to worship? If your church is small enough, or you have a cadre of leaders who can help you divide it up, I think it's a good time to reach out to people individually. Two of the churches I've worked with did very intentional phone calling campaigns in July and August in preparation for kind of Rally Sunday in September. They had already been reopened, but the numbers were small, and they were hoping that their phone calls would result in a big attendance on Rally Sunday. It did not result in big attendance on Rally Sunday. Rally Sunday was about the same as, maybe Pentecost had been. It was a little better than summer, but it wasn't huge. But it did result in increased online worshiping numbers. And they got a lot of information from people. Oh, I'm still worshiping with you, but I've moved to Tucson. They didn't know they'd moved to Tucson. They're still part of their church in Des Moines, Iowa, even though they've moved to Tucson. Right. And so there was a lot of pastoral. It was a big enough church. The pastor didn't, and she was new. Andrew, that pastor, also moved to that church in the pandemic. So she didn't have the individual connections with a 400-member church to know who lived where and why she wasn't seeing them and what regulars weren't there. And that's one of the suggestions I would have for those of you who are moving into new ministry settings. Really depend on your laity and remind your laity. If you're a new choir director, remind your choir members, I don't know. You have to teach me. I don't know what the Christmas cantata tradition is. I don't know how many worship services we used to have on Christmas Eve. I don't know who always gets the candles ready on Christmas Eve. Remind them, because the people who are our volunteers often don't realize how much they know that they need to teach us when we're in a new place. So Andrew, I would really encourage a lot of question asking and being not just humble, but honest and vulnerable. Like, I have no idea. You're going to have to help me, folks. I have no idea who's missing. I don't know if this is normal worship attendance or abnormal worship attendance. And the other connection piece is recognizing that our congregations are still in both trauma and grief. We are still in both trauma and grief. And as leaders, whether you're a choir director or an artist or a worship leader or a pastor, you are a shepherd of the volunteers that you work with. And part of your need will be to shepherd and give pastoral care to them, aware that they are in trauma and grief. Trauma because the world is traumatic and this pandemic is traumatic, and the fact that we can't seem to get it resolved is traumatic. And there are a lot of economic repercussions and emotional and mental and spiritual repercussions to that, all of which are traumatic. And even for the people who managed to manage the trauma, there is the ongoing grief. We look around on Sunday mornings if we're worshiping in person and say, I'm still not seeing the neighbors I want to see. We've let people have died, and we never got to have the memorial service we wanted to have. People have moved away. They moved to get closer to grandkids or to take new job opportunities or to keep their family alive because they lost their job. And so we've had much more transition and change, and transition and change bring grief. So just remembering that part of the importance of connecting is that our people are in both trauma and grief. And we want to help them not just survive trauma and grief, but thrive through trauma and grief. Which brings me to my next topic. Daniel, I'm going to have you go ahead and bring up the next slide. When we are in trauma and grief, it's easy to go into despair. And even those of us in leadership, and I'm seeing this with a lot of church leaders, that we are haunted by despair. I know a lot of you are under a great deal of criticism. People are blaming you that people aren't coming back. People are blaming you for whatever pandemic decisions have been made. They're blaming you for things that are blameless, things that you have no power over, and things that you're just making the best decisions that you can. And you're making it in collaboration with your other staff members and your church leadership team. And I know that this is not an easy time to stick with it in any leadership, in church, in school, in government, in community, in work. But I think in church, it's hardest of all. And I'm biased, of course, because I work with churches and church leaders, but I ache for you. And I want to remind you that we are children of the resurrection. The disciples went through this. Jesus went through this at the Garden of Gethsemane. We know despair, but we know that at the other end of despair, there is resurrection. And I truly believe, and I have seen over and over again, that hope emerges from despair. And I'm so inspired by the Hope on Holly capital campaign that East End United Methodist Church just went through in Nashville, Tennessee. You may or may not know that East End was their building was destroyed in a tornado 10 days before our country shut down in the global pandemic. So they had just had a tornado come through. They had just lost their sanctuary and had 1 week, singing together, lamenting together, and starting to then think, okay, the church is not just a building, but how are we going to be the church when the pandemic hit? And so they couldn't even gather in their parking lot, right? Remember that we weren't even allowed to gather in parking lots. Fast forward 18 months later, they have emerged as such a strong congregation of care for one another and commitment to one another and to the church they are called to be, that they launched their rebuilding campaign in the middle of a pandemic. I don't remember how many millions it is. It's a big campaign to rebuild a church on Holly. That's the street, the street corner that they're on. They called it Hope on Holly, and the campaign is fully funded. And they're breaking ground and they're going to build a new building. They did not let those two back-to-back moments of despair define them. Instead, they allowed those to become fertilizer for new growth. Remember, Jesus says, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth, it is but a single grain. But if it falls to the earth, it can grow multiple grains and become a ripe harvest. And I think this is an opportunity for us to face our despair honestly, and then figure out how we can let hope emerge by letting hope tug us forward into a new reality. Daniel, if we'll go to the next screen, I want to talk about that as a group. I'd like to hear your questions and your responses about what despair is frightening you and frightening your congregation, and what hope is tugging you forward. Anybody? We'll go, and Daniel, let's go to gallery view again. Thank you. What despair is frightening you? What hope is tugging you forward? Any of those? Anybody want to just unmute and chime in? Barry?
Yeah, Barry Cornwall. I'm Director of Music Ministries and Worship Coordinator at Centenary United Methodist in Shadyside, Maryland. We came back into our building the second Sunday in June. We just started in-person singing with masks. Mask up, sing out. We have a sign that says that. And the congregation has been responding. They want to sing more. The choir would like to get together, but they are concerned, even with masks, about singing and rehearsing even at a distance. So it's of great concern. Moving forward, I now have a song leader who takes her mask off, and she's at a significant distance from the congregation. And this is a woman who has a son who has had multiple organ transplants. So she has to be extremely careful. But we've been managing, but people keep saying, well, money, 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 money. Well, even in the pandemic, we have met our monthly budget every month except 2. And it was only off by a couple of $100. People have gotten in the habit of worshiping online, but also giving online. So we need to grasp onto all the little straws that we can to bring people back. And then just one more quick thing. We average maybe on Sunday morning, congregation used to be 90 to 100. But we now average between 18 to 25. However, every week we see 15 to 20 people online. So it's almost equal many Sundays. We did broadcast our first funeral, and so far we have had 60 views of that service. And this was an older gentleman who is not that well known in our community.
Beautiful. Thank you, Barry. Lots of signs of hope there and lots of ideas for all of us to use. I really appreciate that you're finding a way to bring music back into people's lives. And I know it's just different in different parts of the country and different denominations as to what we're comfortable doing, what we're allowed to do. But finding what feels, this is the other thing is, I think being completely permission giving with ourselves and with our teams, what is right for our setting, as opposed to comparing ourselves like, oh, I got to do it the way Barry did it, or I have to do it the way Stephen does it, or I have to do it the way Mary does it. Our settings are all so different, and our comfort levels are different, and our abilities and skills are different. So really trusting that you are sent to serve where you are currently serving, and your gifts and graces are enough. And just leaning into that truth that God promises us that we are enough. We don't need to worry. The hairs on my head are numbered and cared for by God, just as the feathers on the back of a bird. And trusting that, boy, this is a big opportunity to lean into faith and grow in faith in order for hope to emerge from despair. Anyone else, where is despair haunting you, and where is hope tugging you forward? Andrew, I see you saying that in your congregation, there's despair that people will not come back. So this is a church that was averaging 200 in worship before the pandemic and now around 65. And that singing has been a boost in hope. Thank you for sharing that, Andrew. I think singing is a boost in hope. If you're in a setting where you can't do it in person, do include pre-recorded singing in your worship service in some form or another. Or as Barry does, have one soloist safely, most of our sanctuaries are huge, safely distanced from the congregation is a perfectly safe way to let music come back into the life of the congregation. But that concern about numbers is an interesting, I'm not a district superintendent, I'm not a bishop, but here's the deal. I don't care about numbers, and neither did Jesus. If he cared about numbers, he would have worked more kindly with the scribes and Pharisees, right? He cared about disciples. He cared about faithful followers. And he cared so little about numbers. Think about how many people he healed and sent on their way to be disciples elsewhere. We were raised, I think everyone on this call was raised in the day and age of mainline Protestantism being defined by how many people worshiped in our sanctuaries, how many people joined our memberships. That just hasn't been the history of Christendom. It's been 1 century within the history of Christendom. But if you look at our 2,000-year history, Christendom in its richest times has been defined by our impact in the world. And I think that if we can help our congregations to start thinking about themselves differently, the church I serve, similar decrease in numbers, Andrew. A couple Girl Scouts did their, I can't remember the name of the Girl Scout project that's the same as an Eagle project, Gold Star project, I think it's called. But they built a little food pantry in front of the church, like one of those little free book libraries. We can't feed the homeless on our campus yet, which we used to do. We can't host the homeless shelter because of LA County regulations, which we used to do. So we've written lots of checks. That's been great, but people wanted something tangible. So that little food pantry on the corner by the bus stop is a place where people can put in their canned food. They can see poor people and families with children coming to pick up what they need and moving on. It's a little tiny gesture. It's not like it's going to solve food insecurity in LA County by any means, but it gives people a sense of hope that they are still in mission and ministry to their community. And so giving people some sense of tangible hope and helping them redefine success apart from numbers. This honestly has the opportunity to transform mainline Protestantism into a healthy, vital, living organism again. And it hasn't been for a very long time, my friends. We have been part of a dying, crumbling institution probably since I entered ministry. And that's a sad truth. And I'm a prophet, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm a false prophet, but I believe that we have been crumbling and dying for a long time, and we needed transformation. And part of the reason I wanted to bring up this whole idea of creativity emerging from chaos, hope emerging from despair, is to encourage us to look at those signs of creativity. Where can we create a new thing in partnership with the Holy Spirit? Where can we pull hope into the story in partnership with the Holy Spirit? That is always when Christianity has thrived, is in times of despair and trouble when we have helped hope along. So I want to give you a couple hints on how we can help hope along. One is, and this is so important, our numbers are smaller, right? Simplify. And especially if you did a lot of really cool, complex technological things early in the pandemic, this is the time to simplify. Figure out what's most meaningful to you as a leader, figure out what's most meaningful to your people and what you have the skills and resources for, and focus there. And if there's something like, maybe you're doing something huge for Christmas, then let yourself step back in January and February and have a calmer, quieter season. Simplify and really focus on people and connections, not programs and numbers and big splashy events. It's more about connections right now. We're feeling that yearning for community. And the more we simplify, the more we are able to be available. And then, as I've kind of alluded to, play to your strengths. Play to your strengths within your own area of ministry, with your church. My church usually does a big annual cantata, and they can't figure out a safe way to bring an orchestra in, right? And a choir in. So they're going to just bring a harpist this year. So we'll have a harpist and a pianist and the choir. And that will be the cantata, and it'll be beautiful, right? We have access to a beautiful harpist. She's willing to play. Let's play to our strengths. And that's what our music minister decided to do. And then get the resources you need. I have a colleague who has never, ever used sermon planning resources. 20 years into ministry, she's so proud of, 18 years of always, doing her own research. She's a Duke graduate. She takes her homiletics very seriously. But in the summer of 2020, she said to me, I'm pulling out an old series from the summer of 2014. I do not have a creative bone left in my body. Great. She had a great series from 2014 when she'd been serving in another church, and she adapted it to the pandemic, and it got her through. But it also opened her up to resources. And the next thing I knew, she'd subscribed to my worship resource. She started Brian the Music and Worship Planner. She'd started subscribed to, I don't know, a half a dozen worship organizations. She finally joined the fellowship after millions of years of pretending she didn't need us, and found that the resources she needed recreated her energy and her creativity. So get the resources you need, whether it's more volunteers, whether it's written resources, really get the help that you need. Go ahead into the next screen, Daniel. That's part of the reason why I called the fellowship in September and said, I think we should do a revisit of the God, Our Help, Our Hope webinar. I think people need hope and help. And so I want to offer you some free things. There's a free Advent book giveaway to get you started with some Advent planning. And you can visit that marycifres.simplero.com Advent book giveaway. And you'll have this email address, that website address when you get the slide deck tomorrow, which is the other thing. You'll get this complete PowerPoint slide deck tomorrow. I encourage you to use some of these questions with your team, especially if they're feeling discouraged or if they're feeling chaotic and they need help. Just share the slide deck and talk through and answer the questions with each other. And also next week, the video replay link will be emailed to all of you. And we won't obviously have the interactive components, but then if you want to show it to your team or share it with others, or just re-watch it to get encouragement or get some ideas, it will be available there for you. And then Daniel, let's go on to the next slide. A couple other steps for helping hope along. And this is so bold of me to say this to you 3 weeks before Advent. But the fourth step I want to give you is to rest and renew. Matter of fact, Daniel, go ahead and put us all back on screen, because I would love to see a show of hands of how many people who are paid staff haven't taken your vacation yet this year. Who's still got vacation time left that they haven't taken? Go ahead, admit it. All right. Take your vacation before year end. Pastor Mary has said so. Okay. How many of you have any vacation planned between now and Advent? A day off, 2 days off, 3 days off? Anybody? Oh, I like it. More than 50%. Okay. I'd like it to be 100%. So that's your next assignment. Plan to take a few days off around Thanksgiving. I don't care. Play hooky. I have given you permission. Don't tell your bishop. No, tell your bishop. I think all the bishops are saying the same thing. Play hooky, take a day off, do a pre-recorded service, pull in a greatest hits from last year. Give yourself time for rest and renewal. If you can't take a whole day off, take a minute off. Just take a minute and let's just do that right now. Everybody just take a minute, take a deep breath. With your next breath, just imagine the Holy Spirit just filling your spirit. Just breathe in. And now just breathe out all the stress. One more time, breathe in. And then let it go. That sometimes is all the rest and renewal we need to get us through the next minute. Give yourself several of those a day, and you can get through your days. And then lean into grace. Daniel, you can go ahead and put the next thing back on slide. Lean into grace. I didn't look to see how many of you were Methodist, how many of you are UCC, how many of you Presbyterian, how many of you Roman Catholic, but my guess is it's a fellowship webinar with Mary Scifres Ministries. So I'm thinking there's a lot of us who are Methodist on this call. John Wesley believed so much in grace that he had to teach it to himself over and over and over again. He was, our tradition is so much about hard work and production and perfection. But the thing he preached about most and that he taught the most was what he needed to learn the most, and that was to lean on grace. That's the Jesus message, is that we don't have to do it all because God has done it all for us. So when you find yourself overworking and exhausted, lean into grace and trust that whatever you're doing is enough, because God's grace covers all of our work, all of our mistakes, all of our perfections. they are just gifts of grace. So those are just some ideas to help hope along. I do want to encourage you to get the resource that I think will help most of you who are worship planners the most. And that is my worship resource subscription. Daniel, if you'll go to the next slide, called Creative Worship Made Easy. Stephen talked about this. This is one of the resources that my friend who had resisted resources for so long, this fall, she said, "Oh, I'm just doing what you wrote in Creative Worship Made Easy this fall. I'm tired of fighting it." Because the resource, it's lectionary based. There's always one lectionary series and usually one non-lectionary series, a theme for each season, like there's a theme for the whole fall. And she was like, growing closer to God. I would like to grow closer to God. I would like my people to grow closer to God. Okay, done. So she just uses the words for worship that I write each week. She uses the sermon starters to get her sermon going each week. And then the creative worship ideas help everybody else on her team. They have video clips, images, pop songs, traditional songs, and hands-on worship ideas for your congregants to go do something with whatever you've worked on that week. So that's one of my favorite resources. You're probably familiar with other resources that Stephen mentioned. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Daniel. The United Methodist Music and Worship Planner, which I know so many of you use. And then there's an ecumenical version called Prepare for those of you who are UCC and Presbyterian. And then the Abingdon Worship Annual, which has all the words for worship for those of you who have to do liturgy each week. And then there's several Amazon resources as well. I've written the Gospel According to Beauty and the Beast. You can go on to the next slide, Daniel. Is it Communion Sunday already, which Stephen is his personal favorite. And then this year, the free sample that you'll be getting is from Worship at Home for the Holidays. So you can get more details when you see your free sample at the Advent book giveaway. And then go on one more screen down. I think I mentioned Gospel According to Beauty and the Beast, which is, I'm going to be doing a whole sermon series on that in Creative Worship Made Easy in January and February, because we're going to do a book study on that in my church. And then also wedding resources for both LGBTQ weddings and two gender weddings. So those are available for you on Amazon. And my coaching and consulting is also available for you. You just email admin@maryscifres.com, which is Carrie, and Carrie will get you onto my calendar for a free strategy or coaching session to determine how we might be of help. Not just me, but several members of my team who also coach and work with me. Let's see. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks, Daniel. So the point of bringing up chaos leading to creativity and hope emerging from despair are because I believe that creativity and hope are foundational as on the path to transformation. If you're United Methodist, our mission is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I'm actually more interested in transforming the world than I am of making disciples of Jesus Christ. I think disciples who follow any path, who are trying to transform the world into God's realm, are making God's dream come true. And I think your creativity and your hope, when you can find them and let them kind of emerge and begin to define your ministry again, can really create transformation, not just in your life, but in the church that you're serving and in the larger world. And rather than going to more content, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So we'll put everybody back on screen. Let me ask if you have questions or answers to the questions we've already asked that you haven't had a chance to say. And if not, I'll have Carrie start reading off some of the questions from chat and I'll take those one at a time. But others, questions or input or ideas as you've been listening. Just feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. Carrie, you want to pick one out of the chat and I'll just address that one while people are thinking?
There's been several comments and not really questions.
Okay.
Another resource that was mentioned was Fresh Expressions. There was a congregation that instead of doing one large cantata on a Sunday was breaking it up and doing multiples each Sunday of Advent. There was a comment about focusing on the greater community that we are reaching through the online services and maybe not focusing so much on that they're not here, shifting perspective. That's what's going on in the chat rooms.
Thank you. I really appreciate that shifting perspective idea. I think that came from Harriet Wilkin. Harriet, thank you for reminding us, because I think that goes back to play to your strengths. Also celebrate your strengths, right? Again, when we're in grief and trauma, it's easy to get stuck in focusing on the grief and the trauma. And if you've ever sat by the bedside of a dying loved one or a dying parishioner, you know there are miraculous moments in that experience. Sad and traumatic as it is to let someone go, there are miracles of presence that happen there. And I believe there are miracles of presence, God's presence, that happen for us in trauma and grief all the time. If we can just kind of raise our awareness, and one of the ways to raise that awareness is to look for, what are the ways in which I discovered hope? What are the ways in which my church is reaching the community? What are the ways in which we are singing a new song, even if we can't sing in worship? And yeah, Allison Maddox just talked about collaborating with other congregations. I just celebrated how many of you figured out how to do virtual choirs. I never did figure that out. And I thought, I'm just not worthy. You all are just miracle workers figuring out that editing software. So it's just really beautiful the way in which we have had a lot of big successes, the way that our people have stuck with us. So many churches still have balanced budgets and still have people who are faithful members. And the analogy I would give you, as a person who most of her choral life has spent it in the choral chair, not the director's podium, I always resented when I showed up for rehearsal and the director said, "Where is everybody?" I'm like, what am I, chopped liver? And so I think, remembering the 65 people who show up, the 16 people show up, they are the people that God invited and they accepted the invitation. Let's celebrate who came to the feast, right? Remember at the feast when Jesus talks about that parable where all the people got invited and didn't show up? And so Jesus, the parable, the master just invited those who would show up. That's fine. Okay, let's go with who's here. And let's really celebrate God's feast with who's here. So thank you, Harriet. That's a really important reminder. Other questions or input, Jane?
I wondered if you would expound a little more on how to treat the online community as a separate worship service. Are you saying to do that separately or to include them in other ways?
Thank you for asking that, because it is a both and because I didn't flesh that out much. So let me take 5 minutes and flesh that out. So in the early days of 2 worship services in my life, what I didn't invent them. I was appointed to a church that had 2 worship services. And I quickly discovered that although I had longtime church members in both services, they had already developed a stereotype that there was a 9 o'clock congregation and an 11 o'clock congregation. And in terms of worship design, I needed to look at them as 2 completely different congregations. They had no interest in blended worship at that point. The 9 o'clock people only wanted praise band music. They only wanted interactive sermon. They only wanted informal clothing. The 11 o'clock service only wanted choir and organ. They only wanted 3 hymns. They only wanted a 20-minute sermon. They only wanted robes, even when the air conditioning went out in the summer. It was very clear that I was treating 2 different congregations in terms of the worship services that my staff and I were designing. So that was 2 different congregations, and I fully serviced both. Right? I immersed myself in both styles of music. I immersed myself in both styles of preaching, and I served them fully in their own very unique ways. But knowing that they'd only been doing these separate services for about 3 years, so nothing was stuck in stone, I was concerned about the lack of interaction between the 2 groups. So I began finding ways to pull church events together that were both 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. And so, for instance, there was a midweek family event, which was traditional back in those days in the Midwest, but it was always all contemporary music because it was for the young families. But I was noticing, well, there are 2 or 3 young families that come to 11 o'clock, and there are like 50 old people who come to 9 o'clock. So I don't know that it has to be all contemporary music on Wednesday nights. So we would do the Lord's Prayer on Wednesday nights, and we would do a hymn on Wednesday nights. And I asked a couple of the older ladies to come in as mentors to the moms group, so that there became some more crossover between not just intergenerational crossover, but I was really intentional in picking, there's some 9 o'clock little old ladies. Harriet was in that church. A couple of those little old ladies adopted Harriet, who was a young adult. She was in college at the time, who came to the 11 o'clock, right? But there were 9 o'clock old ladies who the young people didn't know were in their service. And so those were some of the ladies that I invited. You should be coming midweek. These people need to know you as more than just a little old lady who sits on the back row. So looking at those, when I think about the both and of getting them together, it's about how do you build community between the online and the in-person community so they start to understand each other. And you have to be careful because they're not going to like the same things. I know Lida does an online breakfast church, and her traditional in-person worshiping community, she could invite them to breakfast church, but they just wouldn't get it. It wouldn't be the right place for them. So if she were going to do something online that included both groups or in person that included both groups, I would suggest it would be out of the sanctuary. And it would be, if it were out of the sanctuary, it would be very informal and interactive. And if it were online, that it would be more formal and structured, like maybe a midweek evening vespers, and invite both breakfast church to come and your in-person traditional community to come. That kind of give you a glimpse into the idea, Jane? Okay. Again, play to your strengths. Each situation is very, very different. Any last minute questions? We have about 5 minutes. I promise we'll be out of here on the hour, but I'm open to other questions. I see Andrew's idea that this two church thing, two worship service thing is helpful in reformatting your second service, and hoping it might move to midweek, so that you could do small groups before and after. That's a great idea, to move something to a different time in the week and to incorporate small group gatherings before and after. And again, small group gatherings can be online or in person. One church I know, the whole time they did online worship, they did it on Zoom the entire time. It was always interactive, and it was a very traditional Black church. Before that, they were used to pastor preaching for 45 minutes and choir and singing for 45 minutes. And they went to a 30-minute online pastor preached. They prayed, they talked, and they did it all the way through until they were allowed to return to in-person, and it worked for them. And so just because you used to have to do it one way in person doesn't mean that's the way you have to do it online. Harriet's got an idea of thinking about people's blessings as a Thanksgiving kind of spiritual discipline. And now maybe going to having them look at hope they have experienced as an Advent and Christmas discipline. That's a great, great suggestion. If you haven't looked at the chat, do take a look. And Carrie and I might even try to organize that and include that in an upcoming email, because there are some phenomenal ideas in the chat that I won't try to read all of them to you, but wow, they're really great. I love getting together with you all. You're so creative. Other questions or ideas that you want to say out loud to the group as I scroll through and see if there's any. Yes, Jane.
One of the things that developed in our church was a food pantry, as it was discussed earlier, but this has become quite a need in our neighborhood, which when we looked into another church that was doing it, they said the need wasn't very great. And they were almost thinking to discontinue it, but our food pantry is servicing 97 families, sometimes more. We have 2 Saturdays a month that food pantry is open, and I go in and pack boxes, and so there's a team of us that pack the boxes of food, and then there's frozen food section of meats and whatnot that go out, along with milk and eggs and things. And it's just been a phenomenal. We pack 125 boxes twice a month.
Wow.
In order to keep up. And they're going to a distribution center near us to get food items cheaper, and then they pick up food items. And it has become community supported, so that the congregation isn't providing as much funding as the community is at this moment. And that's been really wonderful, thanks to Facebook, where it's been lifted up about how many people were serviced and things, and how to contribute to help support it. So that's been very helpful, and it's not leaning heavily on the congregation at large. Also, we have a mission station group that sews for the Midwest Distribution Center, which is in Indiana. And that center provides all manner of things that are either exported to Africa or taken to different communities that are in need because of poverty issues or storm issues, devastation, and whatnot. So that's kind of a lively group of older women, actually. I might be about the youngest one there, and I'm retired.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing up Facebook. We have the opportunity, and I think we have reached a larger community outside the doors of the church because of having to be online, and to continue to use that as a resource to allow people who may not have any interest in organized religion, but want to act upon their faith and want to continue growing spiritually. They don't need to ever join our church. It should never have been about, remember, you're going to hear me, it should never have been about numbers anyway, right? If you are being in mission and service and helping other people grow in their faith and grow in their mission and service, you're doing God's work. It's a win. Put them on your I don't care. Put them in your charge conference report as numbers of participants. I'm good with that. And, you know, have your DS call me if she or he is upset with that. But that's what those reports are supposed to be about, is who are we reaching? How are we impacting? And social media and online give us a bigger platform to serve with people who will never and would never have walked in the doors of our buildings. And that's a beautiful gift. I know we're almost out of time, but Allison Maddox, do you mind to unmute and explain? Allison had a question I didn't know how to answer because I don't understand the question. The chaos of understanding how to incorporate online participants and do worship without singing, but needing music. Allison, do you want to talk about that a little more?
Sure. In some ways, those are two different things, but we do a live stream along with doing the service, and I'm still struggling with figuring out how to incorporate the people that are joining us on live stream into the service. Part of it is I don't have the tech savvy folks sitting in the pews to be able to help out with a lot of it. Excuse me. So I'm limited as to, you know, how much I can recognize those folks that are either leaving something in the chat on Facebook, because that's where it tends to get we're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube. And it just is such a different, right now it's more like the traditional looking worship service that people are just kind of tuning in and watching. But I fully believe in embodying worship. And so, you know, we've talked about contemplative prayer, we're talking about prayer beads right now. And, you know, so there's something tangible to have. But going forward, especially at Christmas time, I am just really struggling because I don't know that any of us have figured out really how to do it.
We really haven't. And, you know, you're absolutely right. I can't give you an answer. I can give you some ideas and things that I'm seeing are working. One, I would just say, and Allison's a preacher, I would say for those of you who are preachers, incorporate some reference to your online worshipers whenever you can. In, you know, when you're asking a question, like if you were a preacher who said, can I hear an amen? You can make a joke. You can amen from home too, right? It reminds the online worshipers that you know that they are with you. And so those subtle reminders, I always welcome the online worshipers very intentionally in my opening welcome as I start the worship service, and remind people who are in person, please remember to join us online anytime that you're unable to attend or you're traveling, and just remind them that we're all in that together. That also kind of gives a clue to my in-person worshipers. There's a bunch of people worshiping with us, not in this building, because they kind of forget and they look, there's only 65 people here. Yeah, but there's 65,
Right.
there's 130 people here, right?
Okay.
So anything you can do because you get to preach, you have some flexibility there. But I think including even those interactive moments in the sermon where you pause, I'd like you all to think for a minute, whether you're worshiping at home or sitting here in the sanctuary, let's just take a minute to think about, what it means that Jesus said, love your neighbor, or whatever your question of the day is. And then really pause. It's okay to have dead time on a live stream because this is a worship service. It's not a performance. And so I sometimes think early in the pandemic, because we thought of it more as a performance, we got in the busy going do, to do, to do, to do. It's okay to pause in live stream worship and remind people this is worship. So that would be one idea. And another idea, and I don't know I know your church is small, Allison, but I want to encourage all churches to think about repositioning staff dollars. Most of our churches don't have the tech savvy volunteers who could monitor the online chat during worship. But I do know the churches that have had the healthiest online experience have someone who's monitoring the online chat. And it makes sense that that would be a paid staff member who is trained by the pastor in kind of pastoral response, and then knows what to say, and then knows to keep things confidential if there's a private chat, and then to bring to the pastor whatever they learned. Alternatively, if you don't have staff dollars or you can't get through that through your personnel and finance teams, it's okay to respond to chats a day or two later. That also works, right? I mean, my best friend died a couple weeks ago. I posted on Facebook. I'm running a really ragged schedule. So I just got around to looking at all the wonderful condolence notes that I got on Facebook yesterday. And I think I got most of them a week ago. And that's okay. That's the way Facebook and social media work. You don't have to respond instantaneously. So give yourself permission that you don't have to be in all places at all times, just because your worship service is in all places at all times, but that you get to be enough. Lean on grace. That is the gift. That is the gift that God gives to us, even in the midst of a global pandemic. I want to thank all of you for being with us today, and look for follow-up emails coming with details from the webinar, so you'll have lots of good notes. And thank you for giving me your early Wednesday morning Mel from Hawaii, and your lunchtime break, those of you on the East Coast. So great to see everybody. Let's just wave and say hello. So in my events, we do a thing called a kiss and a whoosh, where we blow each other a kiss to show the love. So can we all give each other a kiss and a whoosh? Mwah. Fellowship love, Christ love to all of you. Blessings as you go into the holiday season. I am grateful to be in ministry on this planet with you. Take good care. Thanks for joining us.